part one at the last. And now we're going to jump into part two. All right.
I'll drop the handout link here in the chat in just 1 more minute.
Okay, great. So we'll give you a chance to get that out there. Let's go ahead and open this up. And Shelby, let me know when everybody's got it opened up.
Okay, and you can dive in. I'll
Okay.
take a minute.
Okay, so today we're going to go over the contract timeline dates form, PID addendum, my least favorite subject, next to writing a repair amendment, addendum regarding fixture leases, addendum regarding residential leases. If there's a residential lease already in place on the property, it does survive the sale. Notice of buyer's termination of contract, notice of seller's termination of contract, release of earnest money form, my favorite form. If a contract has to terminate, we want that form. Registration agreement between broker and owner in case you've got any off-market work that you're doing. Last year, I sold more off-market properties than I ever have before, and it worked out quite well. Seller's temporary residential lease, buyer's temporary residential lease. Addendum regarding rental flood disclosure. Whenever you have a lease or a temporary lease on a property, and I'm just going to jump in here and chase a rabbit for a minute, you must include that, and that is the decision from the Texas Real Estate Commission. So here is a seller on a seller's temporary lease, right? They've lived in the house 20 years. The buyer has to send them this form that states whether or not the property is flooded in the last 5 years to their knowledge. I know it's like, what are we doing? Let's pull our hair out. I don't understand, but the fact is it must be used, okay? Make sure you don't forget that. And also on a residential lease, just a regular lease, they have to be provided this form regardless of if it's in a flood zone or not. Addendum for reservation of oil and gas mineral rights and addendum for authorizing hydrostatic testing. How many of you think, by show of hands, that when you hydrostatic test a house that you're going to blow the toilet off the bathroom floor? Right? That's what people have a perception of. That could not be farther from the truth. And as we get into that addenda, I will go over what a hydrostatic test is. All right, for you agents that don't really have a system in place yet, maybe you've only worked on a few contracts, I highly recommend that you put together some kind of a timeline sheet. This is the one that I've provided for you. And in that timeline sheet, it's got the specific performance dates that the buyer and seller have to perform. And the reason for that is if there is a buyer shall statement in the contract or seller shall in the contract, and they fail to do so, then that buyer or seller is in default of the contract. And that's what leads to termination of contracts on the closing date. We don't want that to happen to your clients. The idea is to get it to the closing table. Okay, any questions so far about that? So on my recommendation on the sheet, I would put these dates in here and have this sheet as part of the file. And then I would also add those dates to your calendar as a reminder. Okay. And if you're going to have an extension of the option period or a termination prior to the option expiring, don't do it at 4:54 in the afternoon. If the buyer's going to terminate, they should know at least by that morning, right? At least get them that notification before noon. Because if you send it at 4:54 and you think it's all well and done and good, and then Bill Gates has a hiccup in his system, the next thing you know, they didn't receive the termination, you're still bound by the contract. So you don't want to wait to the last minute. And then you do want to confirm, hey, I sent you the extension of option period we talked about. Just want to make sure you received it. All right, we sent over a termination. Just want to make sure you received it. I usually try and get that done before noon if possible, but no later than 2 or 3 o'clock. All right, addendum for backup contract. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more backup contracts. It's a fairly common addendum that's used in our office. And the reason for that is we're still in an inventory, lack of inventory market. Even though the market has slowed tremendously, We're not seeing as many showings. We're seeing properties on the market for 120, 140 days. I have a buyer that's interested in a property out in North Garland and Firewheel, which is a nice area, and that's been on the market for 150 days. And the market is just not treating them very well. They just bought it a year ago. They have to move because they got transferred again. And the house has been on the market for 153 days. Anyhow, so they're hoping for it to get contracted soon, I'm sure. Okay, addendum for backup contract. The contract to which this addendum is attached, the backup contract. So that means is binding upon execution of the parties. So it's going to have an execution date, and the earnest money and option fee must be paid. I'm going to pause here. Make sure if you do an addendum for backup contract that you do have an option period. Don't try and be the hero and say, we don't even need an option. Well, yes, you do, because if halfway through that period between the other contract you're hoping to terminate and it doesn't terminate and your buyer finds another house, you're still bound by this contract. If you have an option period, then you can opt out of this backup contract. So make sure you always have an option period during a backup contract. Now, the other thing is that I don't deliver a full amount of what is market considered market earnest money. Typically we see 1%, right? Doesn't have to be 1%, but that's typically what we see. You don't need earnest money to open a contract at title. You can put zero there. However, put $100 or $150, something like that. And then for the option fee, just put in $25. Okay, if they're interested in that backup contract, typically it's going to be for more money than the original contract they executed. So you're going to need to kind of, need to do your market study, make sure your client's not overpaying. Just because they listed it at $350 doesn't mean that that's the contract they have executed, and probably the listing agent is going to share the amount with you. You can't set up a bidding situation. So therefore, you want to try and do a good market study and come in, if you can, for what you think might be a little bit more than what the other contract executed at. That way, that is an incentive for the seller to go ahead and take your contract and then hope that the other contract terminates. So trying to add strength to your backup contract. So option fee must be paid as provided in the backup contract. The backup contract is contingent on the termination of a previous contract, the first contract dated. Okay, so how do you find that date at 10 o'clock at night? If it's active option or pending or active contingent, if you'll scroll down to the bottom of the listing on MLS, you will see contract date. So that way you can find that date without bothering the listing agent at 10 o'clock at night. For the sale of property, except for as provided in this addendum, neither party is required to perform under the backup contract. This is where people get this addendum wrong all the time. It says right here, we don't have to perform, but it does say except as provided in this addendum. And they put here that you need to deliver earnest and option, okay? So don't forget to get that done. Coach your clients, let them know what they're walking into. Don't let it be a surprise when they execute the backup contract. Oh, now you've got to get earnest money to the title company. Okay, don't let it be a surprise. Make sure you have a planning meeting with your people so that you can actually have them prepared to deliver option and earnest money. Okay. Except for as provided in this addendum, the party is required to perform, meaning that after you've delivered option and earnest, your option period doesn't start counting down, and none of the other criteria in the contract are you required, as the seller or you required to perform until you're given notice that your contract has moved to first position under the backup contract while it's contingent on the termination of the first contract. So if the first contract does not terminate on or before, okay, so you can't extend it out past the closing date because you can't sell a house you don't own anymore. But you want to understand, you might ask the listing agent, when is it going to close? What's the paragraph 9? What is the closing date of the original contract? And maybe your client just wants to hang around long enough to see if they're going to opt out during the option period. So you might just add 20 days to that. Okay. just to give you a date where that the other contract needs to terminate on or before the backup contract terminates. Okay, if it does not terminate, the backup contract automatically terminates and earnest money will be refunded to buyer. Seller must notify buyer immediately of the termination of the first contract. There is a form for that. For purposes of performance of the effective date of the backup contract changes to the date buyer receives notice of the termination of the first contract, called the amended effective date. Now, my strong suggestion is this. If the first contract terminates and you're now a backup contract and you're in first position, draw an amendment. Check the other box at the bottom and state the amended effective date of this contract is, January 31st, not 2023. That way, and the reason for this is that way the mortgage company and the title company both know that the backup contract is moving forward. They don't have to read emails. They don't have to read notices as the underwriters for the title company or the lender. And so because they don't have to read email notices, if you send them an amendment, they must add that to the file. So that keeps everything on track. An amendment or modification of the first contract does not terminate the first contract. Okay. Buyer has the unrestricted right to terminate the backup contract. The time for giving notice of termination begins on the effective date of the backup contract and continues after the amended effective date and ends on the expiration date of the buyer's unrestricted right to terminate the backup contract. So time is of the essence, okay? Meaning, so let's say you offer backup contract, it's executed, you've delivered option and earnest, and then you get notice like 8 days later that the first contract terminated. That day you get notice is day 0. Time is of the essence. And then your option period starts counting from there, okay? And the timeline of the contract starts counting from there. So the day that you're given notice and you have 7 days of option, so that's day 8 is day 0, and then count up to 7 days from there, okay? Any questions about that? People have the hardest time understanding the countdown of the option period, okay? For purposes of this addendum, time is of the essence. Strict compliance with the times for performance stated herein is required, not an option. Everybody good with that addenda? I did such a great job. Okay. Let's go over here and see how many people we have on screen today.
Got about 14.
All right. I'm glad you guys showed up. Is everybody frozen in? I am. I'm not going anywhere. Okay. Addendum containing notice of obligation to pay improvement district assessment 2, and then you have to find the court records and find out who's levying the assessment. There are so many new PIDs out there. There's so many new developments out there. I don't use this form if I don't have to. If it is in a PID or a MUD, I go to the title company and I say, would you please provide me the documents that the buyer and seller are going to sign at closing? Okay. So you can try and work with this form if you want to. You can try and do the research if you want to. You can call the title company if you want to. And that's just extra work on you. And the title company already has the form printed and ready to go. And the amounts are going to be correct because that's something they have to indemnify. I say that, a good title company, they're going to be correct. So you want to make sure that you have gone to the title company, gotten the information. If you want to use this form, great. I don't use it if I don't have to. And so far, I've never had to. Okay, everybody good with that? The assessment has been levied against your property for the unauthorized improvements of which paid in full at any time. So what you need to know is this, is that a PID ends. A PID, when people move into a new property that has a PID, they're offered the opportunity to pay that entire PID up front, or they're offered the opportunity in most cases to finance that amount over 20 years. Well, who lives anywhere for 20 years? We don't. So the people that buy with the PID, I say, okay, you can pay it, or you can keep your money and just pay it every year for the number of years that you're going to live there. If you're only, going to be here for 3 to 5 or 7 years, then why would you pay the whole amount when you can just pay 3 to 5 to 7 years? So because of that, they usually opt to go ahead and make payments. So the buyer, the next buyer, of the property can say, you know, I'm going to be there for the rest of my life. I'll go ahead and pay it off at closing. Well, that's their option to do so. So a PID has an end to it. Does a MUD have an end to it? No, MUDs go on forever. Long after I'm gone, the MUD will exist on my property in Lantana. But there again, I go to the title company and I get the MUD district documents for our water district and I have them applied to the contract. By the way, this must be part of you have to either give notice to the buyer or you provide them documents that they sign for, which I much prefer. You have to do that before the execution date gets put on the contract. Don't be in a PID and a MUD and then think you're going to provide the documents later on or during the option period. They must be provided prior to execution. Okay, addendum regarding fixture leases. Let's talk about solar panels. Let me get on a soapbox. Solar panels are, to me, the kryptonite of real estate. Somebody mentioned the other day that it's easier to sell a timeshare than it is to sell solar panels. That's because there's so many different programs out there and you don't know what program you've got. Talked to a listing agent just yesterday. Hey, they've got solar panels and it says that they're financed, so they're not on lease. Okay, then this document would not apply because it's not a lease. But then how are you going to handle the fact that they're on a mortgage of some type, a stick loan, some kind of a loan? Well, is the company that provided the money for the loan to purchase the solar panels, is that a separate company? Is it a division of the company that had the solar panels? And then what you need to find out is this: did the solar panels, will they transfer? Will the lease transfer to the new buyer? It may not. There are some that say we will not transfer a lease and it must be paid off at the time of closing. The last one I did cost the seller $45,000 out of her pocket to pay off the solar panels because they wouldn't transfer the lease. Isn't that just insane? So there are too many programs out there. There's too many different types of programs out there, bought, leased, whatever. And some will transfer, some won't transfer. And then let's talk about Tesla because they're just on my list of people to talk about. Tesla does not have a phone. You can't call them. You have to figure out which email in the company that you need to reach. And the last time I had one with solar panels with Tesla, it took us a while to figure out who to reach. Now, once we reached that person through email in that department, things went okay, but it took like 6 weeks to figure it out. Not that it was a full-time job to figure it out, but okay, let's send an email here. Okay, wait 2 days and find out that that's not the right email. Send another email. Maybe you should try this one. It was just no fun. Okay. Thinking about buying solar panels, I would not go with Tesla. So solar panels, propane tanks, water softeners, security systems, collectively as lease fixtures. All rights to the lease fixtures are governed by fixture leases. We hope. I don't think so because they all have their own way of doing it. So propane tanks that are leased, water softeners that are leased, all those things that might be leased in the property. As a listing agent, before I take the listing, I want to make sure we have documents up front so we know how those things can be conveyed to the new buyer. Okay. At closing, buyer shall assume and seller shall assign to buyer the following fixture leases: solar panel lease, propane, blah, blah, blah. Okay. The buyer shall pay the first X amount of dollars of the cost necessary to assume or receive an assignment for a fixture lease of the fixture leases, and the seller shall pay the remainder. It's kind of like an HOA transfer, I guess. I would say that if I'm a buyer and somebody has solar panels, I'm doing them a big favor getting them out from under it. So I would say that I'm just going to let the seller pay it off. So I definitely want to put 0.0 there, 0 there. Okay, and then I like to bold it. Add fixtures. Here we go. We blew it and I bold it. Okay. Why do I blue things? Because it's a contrast from the black ink that's on the contract, and it's easier for your eyes to find it. Prior to closing, seller will or will not remove the lease fixtures covered by the fixture leases that buyer does not assume. So you find out that the lease isn't assumable and the seller wants to take their solar panels with them. So you check the box that says they will. Okay, guess what? It destroys the roof. It destroys the roof. So that's going to be another issue. Who's going to repair the roof? In the example that I had there, where it cost her $45,000 to get rid of the panels, they took them off the roof, and they said they went and sealed the roof with a silicone gun. They put it down in the hole where the bolt went through and filled all the holes with silicone, and that did not seal the roof. It did not seal it at all. And we compensated the buyer for a new roof, and they forgot all about it. And I got a call 6 weeks later, this roof's leaking. I said, did you put a new roof on it? No. I said, if you looked at this amendment, we compensated you for a new roof. Oh yeah, I forgot. Solar panels are just a trip down the wrong road, in my opinion. Delivery of fixture leases. Buyer has received a copy of all fixture leases as agreed. Buyer has agreed to assume. Buyer has not received a copy of the fixture leases. That's why, as a listing agent, I want these documents up front. Buyers agreed to assume. Seller shall provide a copy of the fixture leases within 5 days. It's not an election of number of days. They have to provide one within 5 days after the effective date. Buyer may terminate this contract within 7 days after the date the buyer receives the fixture leases, and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. If it's one of those leases where, oh, we're transferring it to you, you have to pay a new rate, and they're not going to pay a new rate, or it's a purchase loan, which would not be on this form, then I'm talking about chasing a rabbit here. But if it's a purchase loan and the buyer has to refinance the loan and the interest rate goes up 3 points, they may not want that. So make sure you have a document written up that will allow for the buyer to, they can assume the loan probably, but to refinance the solar panels at a certain rate. This is where, as a listing agent, you've got to have your ducks in a row. Seller provides buyer with notice of the following oral fixture leases. And you're going, wow, in real estate, everything is written, can't be oral. Well, that's almost true. The reason for this is because there are propane tanks out in areas where there was only like one propane tank for the last 50 years. And that company would deliver a propane tank to the address, and it was a handshake deal. And there's no documentation. So it was an oral lease where they pay the tank maybe $15 a month for the tank, and then they pay that same company to fill the tank when it's empty. So that's why it's possible to have an oral fixture lease. Okay. At closing, there will be no liens or security interest against the lease fixtures, which will not be satisfied at the time of sale proceeds, except out of the sale proceeds, except for the lease fixtures covered by fixture leases buyer agrees to assume. So let's talk about solar panels, because I just love them. The solar panels have a lien on the property. It's on the deed. It's called a UEC-1. So when these solar panel companies out there running around saying, yeah, we don't put a lien on your property. No, they put the lien on the solar panels, and the solar panels are a fixture on the property. So therefore the lien is on the deed. And you'll see it in Schedule C of the title commitment. And so that has to be lifted or removed prior to a clear title. Okay, everybody good? Do you think I love solar panels? Yeah. Okay, addendum regarding residential leases. This would be if the property is under a residential lease. Leases do survive the sale. The seller, there is a termination of residential leases. All leases must be terminated by closing. Back when we had COVID going on and you couldn't evict anybody, I had an attorney I was representing, and he said, I do not want that tenant in that house there up until closing. I want them to be gone at least 10 days prior to closing. So he wrote something in special provisions, and we were allowed to have the tenant removed 10 days prior to closing. So you got to be careful with COVID laws and all the rest of it. COVID seems to be coming back. My wife just got over it. Fortunately, I didn't get it, but COVID seems to be making a second round. So things may be coming back. You just never know. So that's a provision in the contract that the current leases, residential leases, will be terminated. And then there can always be an assign or assumption of the residential leases. Oh, I'm an investor. I'm going to buy this house. and it's got a 3-year lease on it, and they're only into the first year. So I'll go ahead and assume the lease. So you have to provide a copy of the current lease to the buyer right here. And then buyer has not received a copy of all residential leases. Seller shall provide a copy within so many days. You want to make sure that those leases are delivered. And then again, if the buyer receives residential leases and the earnest money shall be, if they don't get them within the number of days, the buyer can terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. Seller provides buyer with notice of the following oral residential leases, propane tank or whatever. At closing, seller shall transfer security deposits. So you want to make sure those are transferred to the buyer. Now, if this is a new investor and you are the agent representing that new investor, you need to let them know that they have to keep those security deposits in a separate account from their general funds. It has to be a separate account. That's by the Texas Real Estate Commission. You can invest the money in the stock market. You can do a lot of things with that money, put it in an interest-bearing account, but it must be separate and apart from your general funds. I would suggest if you're going to invest it in something, that security deposit money, that you definitely have an attorney draw the documents. Except as described below and to seller's knowledge for each residential lease, the residential lease is in full force and effect. Okay, no tenant shall be in default or violation. So they're saying that the lease is in good standing basically through here. If any of the above is not accurate, then please explain that the tenant that lives upstairs is 3 months behind in their lease payment. The buyer needs to know that. And the seller will promptly notify the buyer if they learn of any statements in B3, which is B3, that's this, changes. If the status changes, then they have to give notice to the buyer very quickly. Okay. And then the buyer, I think, if the buyer has a right to terminate, if they don't respond, I think they have 7 days after to respond. If they don't respond, then it's assumed that the buyer waives the right to terminate. Closing date will be extended daily as necessary to afford the parties their rights in time to provide notices under this paragraph. So if 2 days before closing, somebody's late on their lease payment and notice is given to the buyer, then it will extend the closing date. If you have to extend the closing date, there again, draw an amendment so that the title company, if there's going to be a mortgage, everybody is up to speed. The fact that the closing date is changed, because your documents are date specific and you don't want anybody to be in default for not showing up. An amendment helps everybody know that when they're supposed to show up. Okay. Addendum for authorizing hydrostatic testing for this property. What is hydrostatic testing? On the pressure side, where you have a water feed going into the house, you have a water meter, and in most cases you have a little pinwheel, or sometimes it's electronic, and you should be able to observe with everything turned off in the house, no water demand in the house, everything and all the faucets are turned off. If there's a faucet dripping, that pinwheel is going to move, or that gauge is going to move. Okay, you just give it 5 minutes. You can even give it a little longer than that, but make sure that no water is running or there's no demand. All you have to do is crack open a faucet, and that pinwheel, if it's got a pinwheel, will start spinning very quickly, or that meter will start turning very quickly. So that's the pressure side. So where people run the risk of damage is this, and that's on the sewer side. So in order to test the sewer side, the sewer pipe going to the city sewer, if it's city, or to the septic system, that is blocked off. And then the other pipe that leads into the house, into the dwelling, will be filled with water. And if that water level maintains 20 minutes, in other words, they'll fill that pipe to the top of where the foundation is. If that water level maintains for 20 minutes, then it is considered that that pipe is not leaking. All right. And that's a very simple test, but people think hydrostatic, we're going to blow the toilet off the floor. That's not true. And so if it holds for 20 minutes, then the pipes are intact. I will tell you this, that if you're working in houses in older neighborhoods like I do, if it's got cast iron plumbing will start to leak after 40 years. It just happens. It's just a part of life because it rots it. It eats the sewage, eats the pipe out from the inside. And that's just part of the way it works. So you want to make sure that the plumbing has been repaired. Hopefully it's on a pier and beam. If it's on a slab, then repairing plumbing underneath a house, underneath a slab gets very expensive very quickly. So you always want to have a hydrostatic testing done, especially if it's got cast iron sewer plumbing. And also if they've had foundation work done, you want to get a hydrostatic test done. Okay. Now it talks about damages. Well, how could something be damaged? And that's because if you have a leak in the system and it's like underneath the toilet, or it's the shower pan is leaking and they fill it up, and all of a sudden the shower pan leaks out and it leaks into a closet that has carpet, then you've got some damages that need to be taken care of. So who's going to be responsible for those damages? The buyer shall be liable for damages up to an amount of, or the seller will be liable for the damage caused by the hydrostatic plumbing test. If you're taking a listing, it would be my thought that you would want to have it hydrostatically tested if you're working with cast iron plumbing, or have it repaired. Now, I've heard of a new repair, and it is where they actually put a new lining inside the pipe, and they don't have to dig up the foundation, and they don't have to do a lot of extra work. And I'm not that familiar with it yet, but if you look it up, there is something in Google that you can find that talks about relining the pipe. Okay. Notice of buyer's termination of contract. Well, we hope we don't need to use this one, but if we do need to use it, then this is the form. Make sure you have the street address in the city, and undersigned buyer and seller. Buyer notifies seller that the contract is terminated pursuant to the following: the unrestricted right during the option period, right? Paragraph 5 of the contract. Buyer cannot obtain buyer approval. So if you put 10 days and you find out that day 7, the buyer lost his job, well, he's not going to get approved for the loan. So that would be another reason to terminate the contract if they can't come up with the cash to complete the sale. Property does not satisfy property approval in accordance with third party. In other words, third party financing addendum, there's 2 things that have to be approved. The dwelling would be one, and the buyer would be the other. So your 10 days in the previous line, we talked about that. And then what happens if the property doesn't satisfy the mortgage lender's appraisal inspection? Property doesn't satisfy approval in accordance with third party financing addendum. Buyer has delivered to seller lender's written statement setting forth the reasons or reason the lender's determination. So you will get something from the lender. You must provide that to the seller. You just can't wave your hand and say, hey, we've got a termination because it didn't pass the appraisal process. Buyer elects to terminate under paragraph A of the addendum subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association. So I have only seen this used once because you're usually about 18 to 20 days into the contract process. And because of that, the buyer and seller, the buyers have agreed that they're going to move forward. I have seen where a spouse and a spouse did not agree on the house, and one spouse won and the other one lost. And so they said they were going to terminate using the HOA, or mandatory membership in property owners association, as the escape route. Well, if that's going to happen, inform the listing agent and say, look, the couple decided they don't want this house after all. We're out of option. We did inspections and so forth. All repairs were agreed to, but they're going to terminate when they get the HOA documents or the POA documents. So I, as a listing agent, appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and tell my seller, go ahead and release the earnest money back to them. We'll have a release of earnest money form. Let them terminate. Let's get it back on the market. Okay. So if that's going to happen, come to an agreement. That's why you want to stay friendly with the other agent on the other side, even though they may not be friendly. Maybe they're having a bad day. Be their friend. All right, buyer elects terminated relating to seller's disclosure notice. So the seller was supposed to deliver the seller's disclosure notice within 5 days of contract execution, and they failed to do so. So therefore, the buyer has the right to terminate the contract. So that would be taking advantage of that escape of the contract. Buyer elects to terminate under paragraph 3, the addendum concerning right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. Buyers received a copy of the appraisal to the seller. So therefore, the appraisal amount didn't come in where it was expected. I can tell you that in reality, if you'll work hard for your client, whether it's a listing or a buyer, that you will know where it's going to appraise. Get with an experienced agent if you're new, and do a market study together with them. So that way you know where it's going to come in. I mean, you're not an appraiser. Let's just face that. But the fact is that you can predict, or I say predict, you can do a market study, and you know, you can kind of figure out where the appraisal is going to come in. And by the way, we're in a declining market. So we've lost 10% in the last 6 months. So figure out that, you know, we're going to lose another 10%. We might lose another 10% in the next 6 months. So calculate a reduction in the sale price in your market studies. Okay, so that would be about 2% a month, right? Or about 3, well, not 3% a month, about 2% a month. Okay, so figure out that, and once you come up with your number with current sales, not 6 months ago when the market was on fire. Okay, buyer elects to terminate under paragraph 2B relating to seller's disclosure notice. Buyer elects to terminate, blah, blah, blah. We went over that. Buyer elects to terminate under paragraph 6D of the contract for residential condominium contract. So this would be a condominium contract because timely objections were not cured by the end of the cure period. That's a whole separate line in a condominium contract. Other, when would that be used? Got any suggestions? Anybody out there? Richard, you want to chime in? Josie? Basil? Ed? Okay, let's look at that line. So let's say in the contract, and I'm not going to go to the contract because we don't have time. It's already 11:45. Let's say in the contract that the buyer is supposed to deliver a survey within 6 days along with a T47, and the buyer fails to do that. There is a remedy in that line that states that the buyer will buy a survey at the seller's expense, right? But that's also a default in the contract. So the fact that the seller has defaulted because they didn't deliver the T47 in the survey, and so that actually gives the buyer a way out of that contract. When? Right up to closing, they can terminate the contract. That's why you don't want to let your people be in default of contract. That's why we teach these classes. Everybody good with that? That was a good example. Okay. Notice of seller's termination of contract. Notice that's a lot shorter list. You think the buyer has the advantage? They do. All right, concerning the contract between undersigned seller and buyer, seller notifies the buyer that the contract is terminated pursuant to the following. Buyer failed to deliver the earnest money within the time required under paragraph 5. And the contract before the seller provided this notice to buyer. So what that means is this. Let's say you're into day 4 of the executed contract and the buyer has not delivered earnest and option. But day 4 of the contract, the buyer delivers earnest and option, okay, before the seller has a chance to send over a termination. Well, you still have a contract in that case, right? However, looking at it in reality, did the buyer default? Because it says buyer shall deliver. Yep, and that's another reason for the seller to get out of the contract. Here's where things are going to get interesting. So let's say the buyer, because TREC, in my opinion, they didn't address this at all. So the buyer fails to deliver by the end of day 3. And by the way, they have a ZOCAM program. If you've heard of it, the title companies are using ZOCAM. And what that is a snapshot picture of the check sent to the title company with a ZOCAM program, and it has a timestamp on it. So the title company closes at 5:30 at night, but on the 3rd day at 8 o'clock at night, the buyer delivers option and earnest money. It's still a valid contract. They're still within time because there's a timestamp. As soon as you send it, there's a timestamp, speed of light. And so therefore your buyer doesn't have to deliver exactly before the end of business on the 3rd day. They have until 11:59 p.m. to deliver. And that's with the ZOCAM program. So you want to get your buyer with the title company and make sure they have the ZOCAM instructions. All right. And so the buyers failed to deliver earnest and option. So let's talk about that other caveat. So day 4 is there and the seller sends over a termination at 8:30 in the morning. And then at noon, here comes the FedEx truck with the checks. That's why you want to use ZOCAM. You don't have to depend on FedEx in an ice storm. So FedEx comes and delivers a check. What happens to those monies? What happens to those funds? Those funds, the title company has to accept them. And the contract is terminated, right? The option fee is going to get credited first. And so the option money for absolutely positively, even on a terminated contract, is going to go to the seller. Then what happens to the rest of the earnest money? Contract's terminated. What happens to it? Buyer and seller are going to have to agree what happens to it. That's going to be outside the contract. There is no provision in the contract for that. So I would have a release of earnest money form ready to go in case that happens. And that's why you want to stay friendly with the other agent. And I tell my listings, I tell my sellers, look, if something happens and this contract's going to terminate, just give the earnest money back. Just give it back and we can move forward. You don't want to quibble over a few $1,000s when the object of the game is to get your house sold. And so I always give it back. I've had a buyer that had to terminate 2 days before closing because his job description changed and he went from a W-2 employee to a W-9. And so the lender declined the loan. And I told the seller, I said, just give it back. We had a backup contract for 25 grand more. And so they were able to take advantage of that contract. So they did okay on that one. The earnest money, I think, was 12,000. Buyer failed to deliver earnest money and then other identified in the paragraph. So if the buyer defaults in the contract someplace, this is where you're going to put something in here. Now, if you're a newer agent, or even if you're not a newer agent, I would recommend that you have somebody that has worked in this arena before to help you write this. You may want to go seek your own attorney to write this. You might want to have your client's attorney write this verbiage in here if the buyer has defaulted on the contract. Don't be an attorney is what we're saying. Consult an attorney before signing. TREC rules prohibit real estate license holders from giving legal advice. Read this form carefully, okay? And then the release of earnest money form. This is my friend. This is your friend. How many of you ever dealt with a client that was like not fun to deal with? I've had a few of them. And I want the release of earnest money because this form provides the release of all parties, brokers, title companies, and all liability under the contract, not just disbursement of the earnest money. Do not sign this form if it is not in your intention to release. All parties signing this form will from all liability under the contract. Okay, do not sign this form if it is not your intention to release all persons signing this form from all liability under the contract. Read this form carefully. If you do not understand the effect of this release, consult your attorney before signing. But what it does is it makes me sleep at night because everybody is released from all obligation of this contract. Undersigned buyer and seller release each other and the broker, title company, escrow agent from any and all liability under the aforementioned contract. So earnest money typically is going to go back to the buyer. Maybe there's some extenuating circumstances and the earnest money doesn't go back to the buyer. Maybe it's split. Maybe it goes to the seller. Maybe the buyer says, look, I just don't want this house. I'm willing to give you the earnest money if you'll go ahead and release me from all obligation. That's what this form will help you do. Everybody good with that? Any questions about that? Man, he's batting 1,000 a day. Registration agreement between broker and owner. So why did I bring this one up? That's because I've all the off-market sales that I did last year. And so if there's not a listing, okay, then you have to have an agreement with the broker and owner about who's going to get paid a commission for bringing a buyer to their house to buy it. All right. And then this form is what you would use. All right. The asking price of what they're asking. Registration, you have to, as a buyer's agent, you've got to register your buyer with that seller. The term, there's going to be a term there. And then there's going to be a brokerage fee. Do not forget to make sure you get paid. So if you're going to do both sides, maybe you do 5% instead of 6%. Maybe you're just going to, if it's your a relation's house, mom, dad, family, brother, sister, whatever, aunt. I'm working on one with an aunt listing the house. And maybe they're going to have only 3% commission. Okay. I don't need any commission, but I do want the buyers agent to get paid. And this talks about leases and so forth, in case you're representing a lease client to somebody that doesn't want to list their property on MLS. We're not going to go into clear. We don't need to go into that, chase that rabbit. Okay, seller's temporary residential lease. This is a seller's temporary residential lease. So now they're going to become the tenant. Parties to the lease are the lease and the landlord to the tenant and property described in the contract between landlord and buyer, and seller is known as. That's where you put the legal description on the first line. And then I go ahead and put the address of the property in the second line. I go ahead and use both because that's the legal description. Term. Here's where a lot of agents and even title companies get this wrong. The term of the lease commences on the date of the sale covered by the contract, closed and funded, and terminates on whatever date it's going to terminate, unless terminated earlier for reasons of other provisions. And so where does it go wrong? It goes wrong right here. Tenant shall pay the landlord a rental of. Now, there's two schools of thought here. How many of you did free leases last summer when the seller wanted a few days to move out? There's two schools of thought. One school of thought is, in order for there to be a legal binding contract, which that's what this is, there has to be consideration. So if there's not going to be any charge, do you have a legal binding contract? Talk to your attorney. Per day, excluding the day. Here's where it gets messed up. Excluding the day of closing and funding. So people like to say we're closing tomorrow. So tomorrow is the 1st of February. And we're going to count 10 days. So that's going to be 10 days. Well, no, you don't count the day of closing. So it's only going to be charged for 9 days. So that's where you need to make sure that you count your days right. I can't tell you how many times that I see a temporary lease on the closing statement, because some lenders want to see it on the closing statement and some don't. And the amount is incorrect because they counted the closing day as one of the days that the buyer is going to pay for that lease. Deposit. Deposit would be a good thing, especially if they've got a lot of big, heavy furniture to move out and they knock a hole in the wall while they're moving things around the corner. So a deposit would not be out of the question. Utilities. Tenant shall pay all utility charges except, and I usually put the word none there. Use of property. Tenant may use the property only for residential purposes. Tenant may not assign this lease or sublet any part of the property. That's a good statement to have. Tenant may not keep pets on the property except, and this is where I put those that already exist on the property, because they might have a cat you didn't see. They might have a dog you didn't know about. Who knows? So this helps this document flow a lot better if you go ahead and put in there those that already exist. I did have a farmhouse a few years ago where we had to write that there could be no farm animals kept in the house. Why? Because the pigs used to come in the house and we caught them in the house one time. And so we had to put in there that the pigs couldn't come in. All right, condition of property. This is going to be fun and very important. This is why I do not like temporary leases. Tenant accepts the property in its present condition and state of repair. At the commencement of this lease, upon termination, tenant shall surrender the property to landlord in the condition required under the contract, except normal wear and tear and any casualty loss. So that would be a hailstorm or something. Now, here's where it gets fun. Tenant may not alter the property or install improvements or fixtures without prior written notice. Let me get back to which one. Yeah, this is sellers. Tenant may not alter the property or install improvements or fixtures without prior written consent from the landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on the property during the lease become property of the landlord. And then you have special provisions. Inspections. Landlord may enter at reasonable times to inspect the property. What does that mean? the legal term is this is tenancy and sufferance. It is the lowest form of lease that we have. And what that means is that the landlord doesn't need the tenant's permission to enter the house. Knock, 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 here I am, and I got a key and I'm coming in. Okay. Reasonable times, there is a legal definition of that. That is 8 in the morning until 8 at night, 7 days a week, regardless if it's a holiday or not. Okay. 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Tenants shall provide landlord door keys and access codes to allow access to the property during the term of the lease. Now, if you have somebody that's a buyer and they have their key, I highly recommend that you don't go find somebody in the shower, or you don't find them because they're a day sleeper and they have a gun by their bedside that they're going to pull the gun out because they're scared to death because the owner just walked in. Make sure you get permission, make those arrangements. Laws, tenants shall comply with all applicable laws, restrictions, ordinances, rules, regulations with respect to the party. So there will be no rave party on the last day of the temporary lease on the property, okay? Noise pollution. Repairs and maintenance, except as provided by this lease. Now pay attention here. Tenant shall bear all expense of repairing and maintaining the property. Whoa. I had a agent call me the other day. The landlord, the tenant is in the house. He was the seller, and somebody just ran over the brick mailbox out in front of the house. And it's not enough to cover the deductible on the property. What do? I said, go to paragraph 14, repairs and maintenance. It says right there that the tenant will have to pay for it. And so the tenant did. So anything that happens, the pool pump breaks, the air conditioner breaks, anything goes wrong with that property that was contracted to be in working condition at the time of sale, guess what? The tenant gets to pay. That's why I don't like these. I don't like these leases. The air conditioner breaks while they're in the house on a temporary lease, and the tenant has to pay.
Charles,
Yes.
would you also be concerned that they would do the lowest, cheapest possible fix?
Well, yeah, I mean, isn't that normal for just about anything though?
Possibly, but if it's something like an air conditioner or something, that may end up being a bigger cost down the road.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about that. So you have a 13-year-old air conditioner outside and it's working as designed at the time that they contracted the house, and the inspector says it's working fine. Is that landlord, who's the buyer, are they entitled to a brand new $7,000 air conditioner? I don't know. Good question. That would be an attorney question. I hate to defer out, but I would say that if it's working condition, that it was probably, think about all these houses that were built in the 90s. Those air conditioners are tanks and they're ready to roll over this summer. It's going to be a real interesting time. I will tell you that. So, if the tenant reports that to the landlord, says the air conditioner broke, and the landlord wants to intervene, I guess that's their prerogative. But is the tenant going to call the landlord? I don't know. Good question. When the contract is at the closing table and it closes in funds, and I'm not trying to walk away from problems, but I'm saying you're out of the loop. You are done. And you have you're not their agent anymore about this temporary lease. That's where they may need to go seek their own attorney to find out. That's another reason I don't like temporary leases. I want it to be a clean sale. The seller's out. You do your final walkthrough. Everything's good. Reinspect anything that you wanted to reinspect and go to the closing table and be done. Does that help answer your question?
Sorry, I was muted. Yep, thank you.
It's okay. Okay, good deal. Shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by an act or omission of the tenant or any person other than the landlord, landlord's agents or invitees. So the landlord does have, let's talk about that because it talks about indemnity next. When the seller now becomes a tenant, they need to make sure they have their insurance changed, because you cannot have two primary policies on the same house. One of them is fraud, and that's the way the insurance industry looks at it. So if you have a primary with the seller and a primary with the buyer, and this happened in our office actually, where the seller was a coach at one of the high schools, and he used the high school football team moving company. And here comes the great big linebacker that packs all these cans and stuff in this heavy box and lifts the heavy box up and puts it on the gas stove. Click, 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 fire erupts and burns the kitchen down. And so they happen to have two primary policies on the house. So now what you've created is an issue between insurance company and insurance company where they didn't want to cover it because one of the policies was fraudulent. Now, fortunately for that buyer and seller, it was the same insurance agent and the same insurance company, and they resolved it within. They went ahead and covered it. But you could see how difficult that would be if it was Farmers on one side and State Farm on the other. I mean, you might run into an impasse where it's all bad. So you want to make sure that they have the right insurance. So the buyer is now a landlord, and he needs to make sure that he has landlord insurance. It's different than primary insurance. How long can a temporary lease last? 60 days max with a mortgage, because the mortgage company expects that the buyer will take possession of the property before 60 days. This temporary lease document will only last 90 days if it's a cash buyer. Other than that, it's an investment property and there needs to be a residential lease drawn. Okay. If you get into that mess, consult with somebody before you just do it. Indemnity, tenant indemnifies landlord from claims of third parties or injury for damage to the person or property of such third party arising from such use or occupancy of the property by the tenant. This indemnification includes attorney's fees, costs, expenses incurred by a landlord. Insurance, this is where we talk about making sure they have the right insurance. Consult your insurance agent. Possession of the property by seller as tenant may change insurance policy coverage. It will. Default, if tenant fails to perform or observe any provisions of this lease or fails within 24 hours after notice by landlord to commence and diligently pursue to remedy such failure, tenant will be in default. What does that mean? You have to evict them if they won't leave. Termination. The lease terminates upon expiration of the term specified in paragraph 3 or upon tenant's default under the lease. So their lease is no more. Holdover. I always want to make sure this number hurts because here you have a buyer, they've got their moving truck, they're all ready to move in, and the next thing you know, the tenant's not out. I've only had it happen one time. And I actually hired people to help. I was the buyer's agent. I actually hired people to help the seller move out. They had a 3-day lease back to move out over the weekend. The truck broke down and the big sob story. And they wanted to make sure the house was clean. So I hired movers to come move them. And I also hired a cleaning company to clean the house. Why? Because my buyer meant that much to me. Did I fork out some money? Oh, yes, I did. But I wanted to make sure that transaction took place the way it should. I got a call from the tenant that said on the temporary lease, you know, we're not going to be out by tomorrow. I went, well, I can tell you this, and that is that the buyer fully expects to take possession of the property tomorrow. So tell me why you're not going to be out. The truck broke down and the house isn't clean. So I took action. After termination, as damages in addition to any other remedies to the landlord is entitled. So I'm going to put about $450 per day right there, because by the time you park a truck and you have to store your belongings and you get a hotel for your family, it's not going to be cheap. Attorney's fees, the prevailing party in any legal proceeding brought under this or with respect to this lease is entitled to recover from non-prevailing party all costs of proceedings and reasonable attorney's fees. And you've heard me teach before, I've never seen an attorney say they charge too much. They always say that their fees are reasonable. Smoke alarms. The Texas Property Code requires landlord to install smoke alarms in certain locations within the property at landlord's expense. Tenant expressly waives landlord's duty to inspect and repair smoke alarms. That's interesting, isn't it? I would say that if you wanted to be extra cautious and you're buying a 100-year-old house that doesn't have any smoke alarms in it, you might want to go get some battery operated smoke alarms and put them in the rooms. Security devices, although it says that the tenant waives the landlord's duty to do this, to me, it just would make sense. Security devices, the requirements of the Texas Property Code relating to security devices do not apply to residential lease for a term of 90 days or less. Landlord's floodplain and flood notice pursuant. Okay, so this is a temporary lease. Guess what you have to provide for them? The notice of flood. So here's a seller, and this is the document right there. It's TREC number 54-0. Here's a seller that's lived in the house for 20 years. They know it's not in a flood zone, and they know that it hasn't flooded in the last 5 years, but this is still a lease. So the owner, landlord, has got to provide that document to the seller. And it states that, to my knowledge, it hasn't flooded in the last 5 years and it's not in a flood zone. It's required. They put the temporary lease in front of TREC and said, do we have to use this? And TREC came back and said, yes, you do. Okay. Especially if it is in a flood zone. I was showing a house built in 2015 the other day in a neighborhood where it's now in a flood zone. And so, yeah, that you need note, it puts everybody on notice that it's in a flood zone. All right, notices. I want to make sure that we have emails and phone numbers for both tenant and landlord on the documents. Also in paragraph 21, very important to have those that information. Buyer's temporary residential lease. Okay, this is pretty much the same document as the seller's temporary lease, except it's for the buyer. I will tell you this, that if I were you, I would never, ever, ever, never, ever in a million years let a buyer take a temporary lease. Have I seen it work? Occasionally. More often than not, the buyer moves in and says, you know what? I don't think I want to buy this house after all, and I'm not going to close on it. Buyer's remorse. Or, and this has happened twice, they demo the kitchen because they're going to go in and make it their new house. And then they decide it's too much work or too expensive or it's not what they thought. And so then they leave the property and the kitchen's demoed. Or master bathroom, had that one happen. Not me, agents in our office, different office than the one I'm in now. And the buyer moved in, demoed the master shower, decided they didn't want the house. So do not, although it says they're not supposed to make any changes or alterations, do not let a buyer in on a temporary lease unless it's like, oh my God, it has to happen. They can go find an extended stay hotel. That's my thought. Addendum regarding residential flood disclosure. So I told you about the flood disclosure. Here it is. The landlord, who is the buyer, is or is not aware of the dwelling you're renting is in a 100-year floodplain. Well, you would think that they would know. Hopefully it wasn't a cash deal and they just closed their eyes and nobody provided them any documents. And by the way, because what happened I went to a FEMA seminar, trying to think what year that was, 1920, or was it 21? It was before COVID. So just before COVID. And they said that in the last 5 years, so that would be like 2015 to 2020, in the last 5 years, 47% of the properties that flooded were not in flood zones. So we know the flood maps are inadequate. We know that the climate's changing and places are getting more rain than they usually get. And so what's going to happen is the flood zones are going to expand. That's why that 2015 house was in a flood zone over by Lake Louisville. And so the flood zones are expanding, and it's going to be a real problem for those that are buying houses because they change the maps every 10 years. If they're a block away or if they're 30 feet away from a flood zone, the next time the flood maps are updated, they might be in a flood zone. I always pull the flood map and I provide it to my client, buyer or listing. I want to make sure everybody's aware of what's going on. Okay. And in Netris, and I don't know about how many people are here outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, but I'm sure there's a way for you to get to the FEMA flood maps. In Netris, there's a way to look at flood maps. Are all of you aware of how to do that? When you hit print for a listing, it takes you to a screen that asks you, what do you want to print? And flood map is one of those things. And because I don't like killing trees anymore because I sold my tree farm, I save it as a PDF and email it to my client. Damage to a dwelling due to flooding during the last 5-year period. Landlord is or is not aware of the dwelling you are renting is flooded at least once in the last 5 years. Okay. Addendum for reservation of oil, gas, and other minerals. This document has changed. I normally don't talk about this at this stage, but this document changed a lot. Mineral estate means all oil, gas, and other minerals in and under the end that may be produced from the property, any royalty under existing or future mineral lease. So people say, well, how do I find out if the current seller owns mineral rights? Well, the title company is going to help you. You have to hire a landman, and that can be a pretty expensive trip. That can cost you anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000. If you've got a corner lot in a subdivision, I wouldn't bother with it. If you got 500 acres out there in West Texas, you might want to find out. So we actually kept the mineral rights on our tree farm out in East Texas. So you may want to, they may want to explore that with a landman. And if you've got a buyer that means everything in the world to them, they may want to know. Also, mineral rights supersede surface rights. So what does that mean? That means you just sold this 500-acre farm, and you look out Monday morning, you got your coffee cup in your hand, you're looking out your bay window at your beautiful property, and here comes this drilling rig up your driveway because they have a permit to drill. So they could drill even if you have executive surface rights. What executive surface rights does for the owner of the property, current owner, is it allows them to lease the right for that drilling company to come on the property. But you can't withhold the minerals. You can't withhold them if they're owned by somebody else. Texas Railroad Commission, if you want to do some research, that's where you would go. Everybody good with that? Subject to section C below, the mineral estate owned by the seller, if any, will be conveyed. So if they own part of the mineral rights, or if they don't own, or they're not sure, or maybe there's a royalty, the seller reserves all of the mineral estate owned by seller. So right here, that box, if they want to keep the mineral rights. Now, look at this box. Seller reserves an undivided interest in the mineral rights owned by the seller. So I'll split it with the buyer. I'll keep 50%, you take 50%. Note, if any seller does not own all the mineral estate, seller reserves only the percentage or fraction of the seller's interest. So let's say the other family members that didn't live on the property and didn't own the dwelling on the property. Let's say they have 25% each, and there's 4 family members. So all you're going to get is a half of 25%, 12.5% of the mineral rights. You're not going to get rich off of it in today's natural gas prices. I can promise you that. Seller does or does not waive rights. This is a major change. It used to say seller will retain or not retain, and now it says will does or does not waive the rights of ingress and egress. And if the reasonable use of the property, including surface minerals that are part of the mineral estate for mining, drilling, exploring. So this is where if you're selling 500 acres and there's a concern about mineral rights, you want to hire an attorney that is familiar with mineral rights to make sure they can explain this. Do not be the attorney, because anything you try and explain here is outside the contract, and that's when you're practicing law. So do not do that. If seller does not reserve the mineral, all the seller interest in the mineral estate. So seller does not reserve all the seller's interest in the mineral estate. Seller shall within 7 days after the effective date provide buyer with the current contract information of any existing mineral lease known to the seller. Okay. So that means that it also says the current contact information of any existing mineral lease. And here's why you have to know the current contact information. Cherokee Horn came out here and gave big sums of money to people that own corner lots. I helped a gentleman in Fort Worth get $22,000 for signing the lease on a corner lot. It was a bigger corner lot. It was like 4/10 of an acre, and he got 22 grand. I watched him get the check. I was there when it happened. All right, but that was Cherokee Horn. Cherokee Horn went belly up. They went broke. And so because they went broke, Exxon, XTO came in and they took over all the mineral leases. So Cherokee Horn phone number doesn't work. So therefore, if there's a mineral lease and there's going to be reservation of that mineral lease, or it's going to transfer, you need to know the current contact number of whoever holds that lease. And hopefully you have a copy of that lease as well, if you have the listing. If the seller or buyer has any questions about their respective rights and interest in the mineral estate and how much rights and interest may be affected by this contract, strongly encourage to consult an attorney with expertise in this area. Not just the family law attorney, somebody that is a mineral rights attorney. Okay. I don't know if you have this, and that was the last one. So we're actually running a little bit ahead of time. Great. I know I went fast. Sorry. Are there any questions with any of those addendum that we went over? He's that good. All right. Great.
The chat's been quiet also, Charles, so you're doing good.
I guess we're doing great. Okay, TREC 1 to 4 contract. Do you have this in your stack?
I'll double check. I'm not.
I don't think that you do. I don't think you
check.
do. I didn't send that out. So I'm just going to put a plug. This is a 1 to 4 contract as of November 2022. I broke the contract down in paragraphs, and I explain each paragraph as we go. And I also talk about how the paragraphs affect each other. 4.5-hour class. If you ever have an opportunity to come to Dallas Metro North Market Center in Flower Mound, when I teach this class, I invite you to come take it. It's a great class. And you go, Charles, where do you get your education? I go to litigation attorneys because they're the ones in the courtroom. They're the ones that are winning cases. And so I want to hear from them on why things are set up in the contract the way they are. I also, at one time, I was best friends with the TREC commissioner, but she's not the commissioner anymore, Avis Wakash. Avis was a great friend. She installed me as president at the association. And so I go to resources. I just don't decide that this is what this means. I want to go to the people that work in this field every day and get my information. So that's where this information came from. Everything in red is where it's gotten important, okay? Since we have some time, we're not going to change any change to that. Okay. I am going to go open up something else just for you. No, not that one. So the new, as of tomorrow, the new forms are mandatory. How many of you took a class on the new changes? If you haven't, you need to go to the TREC website and review those new forms. They're already in your stack, but the changes are many. One of the biggest changes is this, and I'm going to go to the contract first. So everything in blue there, that's a contract change. Cash portion, this has to do with hard money loans, and now there's a new third-party financing addendum that includes that. Notice I put in here, I highlighted the word shall, seller shall, buyer shall, escrow agent under this paragraph shall be applied first to. So shells are commands in the contract. There's 38 commands in the contract. Most of them are falling on the seller, seller shall, seller shall. And if the seller fails to, or if the buyer fails to, then that is a default in the contract, and that is a reason to terminate the contract, even on the day of closing. So you want to be very careful with that. So let's go to paragraph 7, because this is a major change. Property condition, right here. Seller shall provide buyer with copies of documentation from the repair persons showing the scope of work. That is a new phrase in the contract, scope of work. How many of you are familiar with scope of work? Scope of work includes this. I used to be in an industry where scope of work was a requirement. You have your complaint, you have your cause, and you have your correction. You want to go ahead and write that down. Because if there are repairs agreed to, no matter who does those repairs, you need a paid invoice that shows scope of work. Complaint, cause, and correction have to be on there. So that's going to be a game changer. No more will, well, I say no more will. There's going to be somebody that tries the waters, I know. But the air conditioner is not cooling as designed. Go ahead and put 2 pounds in it. Don't find a leak. We don't care if there's a leak or not. Just get us past the contract, right? And then we'll let the home warranty company figure it out. You can't do that anymore with this. Scope of work, complaint, cause, and correction. Under correction, if the air conditioning technician found a refrigerant leak at the evaporative coil and the seller said, no, I'm not fixing it, with scope of work written down, they have to write down that technician found a refrigerant leak at evaporative coil, seller or client or customer declined repair. Wow. Do you think that's going to change things? Wow. Yes, it is. It's going to change a lot. And that has to do with plumbing, electrical, and everything. So you hire the electrician to come out to look at a circuit, and the electrician comes out and says, you've got a Zinsco box, which, by the way, the general inspector probably picked that out. And if I'm selling an older house or I'm buying, have a buyer on an older house, I look at the circuit box. Zinsco boxes were found to cause fires. I won't go into all the reasons. In reality, it wasn't the Zinsco box fault, but they had to recall all their boxes, and they went broke doing it. And so there is no more Zinsco, and you can't buy any parts for that Zinsco box in the garage or in the closet, wherever it happens to be. And because of that, the electrician comes out and says, I can't fix this circuit because you have a Zinsco box and it needs to be replaced. Probably at the cost between $2,500 and $3,500. Just depends on the setup of the property. So I said that to say this: scope of work is going to be huge. You need to make sure the vendor is going to provide a scope of work on their paid invoice.
Charles,
Anybody have questions about that? Yeah.
we do have a question from Ruth in the chat. If you execute a contract today using the old forms, how do the new forms come into play?
It doesn't. If you execute it today, today's the last day you can execute the old forms. Okay, but I don't know how it's going to go, but those old forms are going to be removed from the system at some point in time. And what if it happens tonight at midnight? And then you need to draw an amendment to the contract, and all you have is the new amendment. You've got a conflict. So I would say if you're going to execute a contract today, you want to use the new form. Keep you from having to rewrite the whole thing or whatever. Draw another amendment to change to the new form something. I hope we don't have to get into that mess. That would be a heck of a correction, that's for sure.
Thank you. And is there any way we can get a copy of this version you're using with the highlights that we can share?
Yes, if you will email me your email address, and I'll give you my email address. And it's Charles, CHARLES @ and then it's all one word, Dallas Homes with an S, TX.com. DALLASHOMESTX.com. And if you'll send me an email and say, I like the highlighted version of the new contract, I'll be glad to send that to you. Okay.
Thank you, Charles.
You're welcome. All of you can, I'm glad to do that for you. So let me just give you an idea of what scope of work looks like. So document repair, scope of work, 3 C's, complaint, cause, and correction. General inspection, HVAC not cooling. Amendment reads, see attachment A, because I always use an attachment. By the time you fill all this into that little tiny space, you've made the printing so small that if you scan it once or twice, you can't read it anymore. And once you can't read the printing, then you don't have a valid document. So I always put an attachment, and it's an attachment A. I don't say that I write amendments because I'm not an attorney. Attachment A, 123 Main Street, and whatever date it happens to be. Have licensed HVAC company inspect, service, and repair. Do not leave out one of those words, because if all they're going to do is inspect it and not repair it, then that's a problem. If you don't get it serviced, then they're going to come inspect and maybe they repair, but they don't service the rest of it, right? So you inspect, service, and repair HVAC system to function as designed. Currently not cooling. Seller shall provide paid invoices with scope of work explained at or prior to 5 days before closing, so reinspection can be performed before closing date. So that is a slight change to what paragraph 7 calls for, because paragraph 7 says that on the day of closing, you can provide the scope of work paid invoices. Well, we might want to send the inspector back in to inspect the work. So we want the work done prior so we can have an inspector lined up to go check. Repair invoices must have scope of work explained. Complaint: HVAC system is not cooling. Inspect, service, and repair is needed to function as designed. Cause: inspect HVAC system not cooling. Found bad contactor switch at outside condenser unit. Outside condenser unit needs to be cleaned. So that's what they found on the initial inspection. Correction: replace bad contactor switch at outside condenser. Clean exterior condenser. With system operational, inspect and service HVAC system. Pressure check, show system low on refrigerant. Add 2 pounds of refrigerant. Check system for refrigerant leaks and found no leaks at this time. It is possible, not really all that possible, but it is possible. The air conditioning system is a sealed system. It should not be leaking. System working as designed at this time. So they didn't find any leaks, although maybe they checked and hopefully they had a leak detector to check with, or they did pull the covers off and did a visual inspection looking for oil around the condenser or so forth. And you're asking me, how do you know all this, Charles? Because I was a licensed air conditioning technician back in the 70s. All right. Alternative correction: replace the bad contactor switch at the condenser, clean exterior condenser with system operational, inspect and service HVAC system. Pressure check, show system low on refrigerant. Add 2 pounds of refrigerant and check system for leaks. Tech found interior evaporative coil leaking. Disassemble interior unit, replace evaporative coil. Charge system with refrigerant. No further leaks found at this time. System working as designed at this time. So that would be an additional repair. So let's get a little deeper into it. How many people, sellers, are going to say, here's my open checkbook, go ahead and spend 10 grand? They're not going to agree to that, right? So what we used to do, this is back in the old days, back when we wrote our dinosaurs to the showing, we used to put how much money that the seller would be liable for towards the repair. But here's the deal. Your buyer doesn't want to buy a house that's got a better air conditioning system unless there's some compensation, right? So the thing to do is, if the air conditioning tech goes out and finds out that there's an issue, you want to make sure this is all done during an option period, or that the buyer has an escape route. Maybe it's HOA documents, right? So you want to make sure that the system's going to be diagnosed and tested prior to the option period expiring. So you may have to extend the option period a few days. It would be my recommendation, if you've got a listing, since now scope of repair is going to be a big deal, it's as expensive as having foundation work done. Have all the documents online that you had the system inspected, serviced, and repaired, and it's functioning as designed before you list it. Okay, doesn't that make a lot more sense? That way, when the general inspector comes to do his inspection, you want to provide, if as a buyer's agent and also maybe as a seller's agent, listing agent, you want to provide that inspector with the seller's disclosure. You want to provide him with all the foundation work, if there is any. You want to provide them any receipts where the scope of work has been done, so they know what they're looking at. That makes that inspector that much better at the time of inspection, and that makes it to where they don't call things out that they don't need to call out. Now, here's one thing, I'm going to hop back on air conditioning. General inspectors are required to determine if the air conditioning system is working as designed, but they're not HVAC technicians, and they don't have gauges, and they're not going to break the system open. So what do they use? They use that little thermal gun. So in the utility room, you have that little bitty 4-inch vent, right? And over in the master bedroom, you've got these 2 8-inch giant vents. Well, typically you're going to have a temperature differential between the bedroom and the vent in the utility room. So you want to make sure that, I know the general inspection is going to show you have to have between 14 and 22 degrees differential from inlet to outlet. So they go to the inlet, And then they, and maybe it's 80 degrees at the inlet when they turn the air conditioner on. And then the outlet should be blowing out at 68 degrees or 66 degrees. And so they're looking across the house at every outlet vent and checking it. They're finding out that they're all different. But nobody's going to redo the ductwork in the attic, is what I'm trying to say. And in order to balance out a system, it would cost a ton of money to have somebody go up there and rebalance a system in a house, in a residence, because if you've ever looked in an attic, the HVAC ducts in the current systems, they look like snakes running through the attic, and some of them are great big and some of them are real small. Well, nobody's going to redo all that, but the inspector has to mention it. That's why you have the HVAC technician right in there that it's working as designed at this time. So there's still going to be a temperature differential, but it's still working as designed, okay? General inspectors are found, they have to do what they have to do. Any questions about that? All right. I'm really kind of out of today's information to talk about unless you guys want to go over anything else. Is there anything else you want to talk about? I didn't realize I was going to get through these addenda that quickly. Sorry. So instead of keeping you for 2 hours, we're going to keep you for 1 hour and 35 minutes. Everybody good? Thank you guys for coming. The next class, if you look at your material, is going to be, we're going to go back to part 1 and we're going to show, I'm going to teach that one again on 2/7 of 2023. All right, and then 2/28/2023, I'm going to teach the second part. So there's kind of a gap there. So today you got part 1. On the 7th of February, you're going to get part 2. And then on the 28th, I'm going to teach part 2 again. I mean, part 1 on the 7th. And then this is as far as we've drawn out the schedule. So I just want to let you know. Any questions before we say goodbye?
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Basil.
Thank you.
Richard, you good?
Thank you.
Josie, Ed, you good?
Thank
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you, Charles, so much for your time. Everybody stay warm.
Yeah, stay warm and stay off the ice. All right, have a good one. Take care. Bye.
Have
now.
a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.